Hello and welcome. This is a video review of a video Matt Dillahunty released a couple of months ago called Atheism, the Null Hypothesis. Now, whilst this video is pre-recorded, it offers my live take on certain sections of the video and then goes on to explain other bits about various arguments and scientific takes. Now, whilst Matt originally starts defining the null hypothesis in a scientific way and gives some sort of scientific examples, he then goes on to switch his use to a non-scientific use and doesn't really explain how he's redefining it. And then he gives a few problematic examples. So this video is aiming to provide some supporting arguments and some references. I'll try and remember to put them in the comments as well, or the description, should I say. And where appropriate, I'll address each section of Matt's video with this and then give a more complete overview at the end. And finally, a small challenge for Matt. Now, if you don't know who Matt Dillahunty is, he's someone that's done a fair bit of good work over the years, and even if I might not agree with some of his methods on his call-in show when he used to be on the Atheist Experience, he's also made some salient points, and he's fought a good fight in an area that is rife with fundamentalism. So I can understand why sometimes he is quite fire and brimstone himself, and I'm lucky that I've not had to deal with that sort of thing. My disagreement is with some of the things that he says. It's not with him as a person. So don't take anything I say here as necessarily an attack on him. None of it is supposed to be an attack anyway. It is just addressing what I find to be a problematic take. I think the fact that I don't personally have to deal with the sort of fundamentalism, and whilst a lot of the people who are involved with Answers in Reason don't have to deal with these sort of fundamentalist views on the regular, apart from when we talk to people online, is why we have a more relaxed and friendly take to the theists that we encounter. And it's probably why the theists that we encounter tend to be of a higher caliber and have decent arguments and respond to us accordingly, and it doesn't get to that sort of poo-flinging sort of state. And this in turn is probably why we try and address the bad arguments within our own camp as atheists ourselves. We see logic, science, history, and philosophy being misapplied and misunderstood by so many other atheists online and think that it's actually important to address this, especially when many of us atheists claim to be rational and critical thinkers, good skeptics, and so on. When we do video reviews or comment reviews, we usually hide the people's names because we're not trying to name and shame. However, when someone is a bit more of a big profile, like Matt Dillahunty is, at least within the atheist community, it makes sense that people are aware that we are addressing this argument from him. I'm also joined remotely by Bearded Heretic today, and he will be armed with his experience and a number of different references as well. So, how you doing, Luke?
Hi Joe, Luke here. Bearded Heretic.
Luke, could you provide me a little bit of your background, please?
I've done a Master's in Forensic Psychology, and during that Master's I did Advanced Statistics and Research Methods.
So obviously, this is why Luke has a fairly good understanding of concepts like the null hypothesis, and throughout conversations and the people who are involved, either as viewers or friends or actually in Answers in Reason, there's a few people with relevant degrees where we've discussed this topic and tried to iron out any facts and objections before they come up. So, as I mentioned, we're reviewing Matt's video, which is Atheism, the Null Hypothesis. You can find that video by clicking here, and I'll put a link to the video and the channel within the description as well. So, as I said, this video is pre-recorded, but all of my comments are actually sort of live first take type comments that I wanted to do, because I actually quite like a live review with fresh responses, though I haven't had the time recently to do it, so I figured it's best to get this video out whilst the iron is still kind of warm. And so therefore you do have my live responses, but in a pre-recorded video.
The Atheist Debate Patreon Project presents Atheism, the Null Hypothesis. Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. There's been a lot of discussion on Twitter because I've made a couple of claims over the years that different people take exception to, including a number of atheists. And one of the ways that I tried to describe the burden of proof and finding the default position on the theistic proposition is to use the principle of the null hypothesis.
So here, from the beginning of the video, we can already see that Matt has a goal in mind. He wants to blend concepts, atheism, default position, burden of proof, the null hypothesis, all together, and they're concepts that are not necessarily linked or logically entailed, or, depending on the context, even appropriate to use. So it will be interesting to see where he goes from here.
Now, for those who aren't aware, I'm sure you could run over to Wikipedia and look up what is, well, I'll tell you what Wikipedia says about the null hypothesis. In scientific research, the null hypothesis is the claim that no relationship exists between two sets of data or variables being analyzed. The null hypothesis is that an experimentally observed difference, or any experimentally observed difference, is due to chance alone and an underlying causative relationship does not exist, hence the term null. In addition to the null hypothesis, an alternative hypothesis is also developed, which claims that a relationship does exist between those variables.
So he provides a Wikipedia version of the null hypothesis that, to be fair, isn't too inaccurate. However, what is lost here is the first question that should be asked, and that is, what is a hypothesis?
A hypothesis is a claim made about the world that can be tested and can be falsified. So an example of this would be ice cream melts faster in hotter weather is a hypothesis.
So a hypothesis is an assumption or an idea proposed for the sake of argument so it can be tested. It is a precise, testable statement of what researchers predict will be the outcome of the study. So a hypothesis is more than just a claim that there is a relationship between two variables. It also has additional qualities. One, that it is falsifiable, and two, you have the ability to operationalize it. So, what is falsification?
Falsification is the ability to demonstrate that something could be wrong. Now, a lot of people say it is the proving something's wrong, but that's not the case. Falsification is setting up the circumstances to be able to prove that something could be wrong. So in this situation with the ice cream, the falsification is showing that they're setting up a set of circumstances that would show that ice cream doesn't melt faster on a hotter day. So, for instance, you would put the ice cream into a room that has a set of temperature gauge that you can change the temperature on, and then you'd measure it. And if you found that the ice cream didn't melt faster, the hotter the temperature got, then that would be falsifying the claim. That's what falsification is, being able to set the circumstances for being able to prove it wrong.
When something is falsifiable, it means that it has the ability to be shown false. Cool. There's aliens on Ursa Minor is unfalsifiable right now, but one day it might be. There is a visible green alien in my hand right now. Is falsifiable in this moment. God kickstarted the Big Bang is completely unfalsifiable, and probably always will be. But never say never. Science may actually one day develop a way that we can look into the metaphysical. So we could say that there are different levels of falsification. Something could be completely unfalsifiable, or it could be falsifiable in principle, but not actually right now, because we don't have the means to test it or examine it or anything like that. Or something is actually falsifiable right now in this moment. So if we consider something like the weather, and a prediction of the weather, it will rain tomorrow is unfalsifiable right now, but it is falsifiable in the future. It's not repeatable because the conditions of every tomorrow would be different, but due to meteorology, we can make predictions that, whilst are not falsifiable yet, we can be justified in believing, at least if there is an outlet that has pretty accurate predictions. And over time, our models of weather patterns and things like that will get better and better, at least hopefully, and we will have even more accurate predictions. Luke, what does it mean to operationalize a hypothesis?
Ice cream melts faster in hotter weather. In order to operationalize it, you need to add measuring values to the hypothesis. So it's not just enough to say ice cream melts faster in hotter weather. You have to say ice cream will melt faster in milliliters per second when the temperature of the day is hotter in degrees Celsius. And that way you can measure the actual variables.
So part of a hypothesis seems to be that we can test it even if we don't. And what we would be looking for in that test, what would show a hypothesis true or false, for example. So simply speaking, something like a God exists is not falsifiable, and it doesn't have the ability to be operationalized. But we could perhaps test qualities like the efficacy of prayer. And what I mean by the efficacy of prayer is obviously if we are talking about prayers where you ask for something like the ability to heal the sick, we could set up an experiment where we have different groups of people, some being prayed for, some that know they're being prayed for, some that think they're being prayed for, some that definitely aren't being prayed for, and so on. And we could then record the results and see if there's any sort of significant difference between the various groups. However, even if those various hypotheses were falsified, it wouldn't necessarily show that there is no God. It would just show that the types of prayer where something is asked for isn't something that works. So if your God is necessarily tied into God heals the sick, and actually it shows there's no difference between people that are prayed for and not, then arguably that God is proven false, or you've got that bit wrong about your God. It doesn't prove that there are no gods. It doesn't even prove that that God doesn't exist. It just proves that an idea you have about that God is wrong. We could also falsify God claims based on logical contradictions, for example. But again, that's a look at a specific claim about a specific God. So a general statement of a God exists, or at least one God exists, is not falsifiable, and we cannot operationalize it. And therefore, theism is not a hypothesis.
And because of that, when you start going through that entry at Wikipedia and the entries elsewhere when we're talking about scientific exploration, what you find is that people will view this as if it's only applies to large statistical models. And they're both, I would say, correct and incorrect. The primary usage for something like a null hypothesis is in medical research and things like that, where you're going to be sampling a number of different populations. And so you're going to be evaluating, how did this portion of the population respond? How did this portion of the population respond? Is there, to determine if there's a connection between the medication that you're giving them and their symptoms. But that primary objection that this only applies to large statistical analysis is somewhat flawed.
This is interesting because I've not actually heard that it can only be applied to large sets of data. I'm not sure where he's got that idea from, but what I think he misses, and has missed in conversations that I've had with him previously, at least on Twitter, is that the null hypothesis exists in relation to at least one valid hypothesis. Perhaps a miscommunication is where he got the idea from about the large data sets, or maybe it was someone else who said something along those lines.
The null hypothesis, in principle, can't be proved. You can consider it like a universal negative. There's no way to show that there's no connection at all between two things without having exhaustive knowledge. But disproving the null hypothesis, showing that it is false, is the whole point. And you can often do that with a single point of data. If you say, I get it, this isn't statistical analysis in the broader sense, but if you say there is no cat in my sock drawer, then going in and looking in there and finding a cat disproves the null hypothesis. And people are going to say, yes, but opening it and not finding a cat would prove the null hypothesis. And you just said that the null hypothesis in principle can't be proved. Correct. I'm trying to make these examples as simple and straightforward as possible.
I think the problem with making examples too simple for the concept is they don't really work to explain the concept fully, although they can be helpful on getting your understanding there. One thing it does show, though, is that you can prove a negative in some circumstances, which is one of those terrible takes that I really don't know why it is so popular within the atheist community. You might have heard someone say, you can't prove a negative. But yes, you can. Not all negatives, but you can prove a negative. I mean, that is essentially what falsification is, after all. But Luke, what is a null hypothesis?
The null hypothesis is just like this type of hypothesis, except for the fact that it makes the claim that there is no significant difference between the results of the dependent variable based on the independent variable. So the independent variable is the one that we don't change, and the dependent variable is the one that we do change. So in this situation, it would be the dependent variable would be the amount of milliliters per second that the ice cream melts, and the independent variable will be the temperature of the sun. Now, this would be a quasi-experiment, or the temperature of the sun, temperature of the day. This would be a quasi-experiment because we don't necessarily adjust the temperature of the day. We could put it into an actual experimental situation by making it like by changing the temperature of a room, for instance, to a set amount of degrees, but you can do it just with the day and just take a measurement of the day's weather, but that's quasi-experimental. There may be other factors that influence it. So the null hypothesis would say there would be no difference. There would be no increase in the rate at which ice cream melts in milliliters per second, depending on the temperature in degrees Celsius. That would be the null hypothesis.
So the null hypothesis states a negative statement to support the researchers' findings, that there's no relationship between these two variables. They will often have a significance quota that they will fill. Perhaps they'll allow for a variance of 5% either way. It depends on your overall sample size and how accurate this actually needs to be. And when it's something between people, obviously there are variable factors that you have to take into account. Now, a better example than Matt's might be that people being prayed for heal faster than those not being prayed for, as H1. If there's no significant difference between those being prayed for and those not, we have our null hypothesis. Prayer has no effect on those being prayed for. With this sort of experiment, though, you can have multiple hypotheses. You might have an H2 in there and, talk about people who know they're being prayed for. And then you might have H3 being that, people being prayed for actually heal worse. You could add in a number of different hypotheses if you so wished. But ultimately, H0 would still be the point where there is no considerable difference between variables.
The null hypothesis is the falsification. It is if you don't reject the null hypothesis, you are falsifying the alternative hypothesis, which is exactly what the whole purpose of the null hypothesis is to act as that falsification method to make sure that we're actually testing effects that can occur, and that we're not just testing like chance, because that's all the null hypothesis is about chance. It's about was the results of my study, because if I say, for instance, I test two ice creams and one melts faster than the other, and I say, well, actually it was colder on this day, I don't know, maybe it's just chance that ice cream melted faster. There will be situations where that might happen. So doing it in this way eliminates or makes it less likely that chance is the thing that's caused the difference that we see in the data.
The bigger issue here is that what we're talking about is the core principle of establishing a default position on an issue, setting up a burden of proof.
He does love these catchphrases like default position and burden of proof. I'm not sure they necessarily apply.
It's still a statistical evaluation, even if you only have a tiny sample set. And it's not a problem for the null hypothesis because the null hypothesis needs to be constructed in such a way that it couldn't be confirmed, but that it can be falsified.
Okay, yeah, sure. The null can be falsified. Agreed. That's one of the parts of a valid hypothesis.
And it's not the fault of or the problem with the null hypothesis if we don't have a data set that actually allows you to disprove that hypothesis.
See, I don't know about you, but he's starting to lose me here. The null is set up in a way that it's in relation to H1 to Hn, at least one other valid hypothesis. The H1 to Hn have to be falsifiable and also have the ability to be operationalized. So H0 could exist without any data to falsify it, but not without a valid H1.
A prime example of this principle, not statistical analysis, but the principle of the null hypothesis in action, is innocent until proven guilty.
Okay, so at this point, he's actually starting to confuse the matter by throwing in the legal system. The legal burden of proof can vary based on the crime and other contexts. Proof here isn't absolutely conclusive, just often beyond reasonable doubt or a certain majority convinced. It's far more subjective than a scientific hypothesis. I mean, Luke, what's your take on this?
The null hypothesis is not used in the criminal justice system. The innocent until proven guilty is not an example of the null hypothesis, and you won't find the null hypothesis referenced in any form of case law or any judicial thing. It's not a part of the criminal justice system. The innocent until proven guilty concept was actually created prior to the falsification concept in the 1930s by so falsification was created in the 1930s by Karl Popper. Prior to that, it kind of didn't really exist as much. So innocent until proven guilty isn't a null hypothesis, but even more so, there's another layer to this. Innocent is not the null of guilty. Innocent is its own claim in itself. You could have not innocent until proven innocent. That would not innocent would be the null hypothesis in that situation. So you can see how it doesn't actually work in that situation. The null hypothesis is a negation of a claim. It's not the negation of a positive claim. It could be a negative claim as well. Someone is innocent could be a hypothesis in and of itself. So it really doesn't actually work in that way.
I think what Matt is trying to say is we should accept the null hypothesis when no other information is available as a standard. The problem is that's not what the null stands for. The null hypothesis is actually never accepted. It sits in the place of not rejected and rejected, at least once an alternative is provided.
The null hypothesis is barely used colloquially. It's not something that is used in a way that is used every day. It's exclusively kind of a statistical term that's used in science. And null hypothesis testing isn't actually the only way to do experimental tests. Like in physics, when for ballistics, for instance, if you're shooting something, you just want to do the maths in order to come up with the result. You don't necessarily need to do a null hypothesis test to see the difference between two variables, because you're not looking at two variables in that way. You're not comparing those. You're not looking at difference. So null hypothesis testing isn't even exclusively something that happens across the entirety of science. Even in psychology, which is my field, we have field tests, we have conversation analysis, we have qualitative methods, which are not null hypothesis testing. Even in quantitative testing, not everything is null hypothesis testing. It is one form of testing for a specific type of experiment, and it is a large group of experiments that use null hypothesis testing, but it's not all of them. It's not required to be all of them. And there's kind of this myth around, that scientists don't believe the alternate hypothesis until it's been proven. I mean, that is technically true, but you wouldn't be doing the test if you didn't think that there was some element of truth to it. That doesn't make any sense. So thinking psychologically, thinking about what people are actually thinking, rather than the institution's standards to maintain good scientific data, people will believe that the outcome that they're going to have is a positive one. They want the alternative hypothesis. Null hypothesis results are barely ever published because they're not the desired ones. People want to prove that their effects do exist, and because of that, they they do believe that those things do exist. Otherwise, they wouldn't be testing them.
Presuming that someone is innocent, which may be impossible to prove, is an accurate default position in null hypothesis, because the burden of proof is on those that are asserting that this person is guilty. And as soon as you present sufficient evidence, you will have confirmed the alternative hypothesis that they did this, committed this crime, and you will have disproved the null hypothesis.
This isn't necessarily the default position. From a legal perspective, yes, the person is innocent until proven guilty, but as Luke described, innocent isn't the null, and people often believe an alternate hypothesis before testing. Much like someone might think that someone was guilty, even though not legally so. Consider if you were a victim of a horrific, violent, and abusive crime and saw the person, you knew who it was, you absolutely know that they have done this thing to you. Is that person innocent because they haven't been proven guilty yet? He's also saying that the burden of proof is on those saying that they are guilty. Sure, okay, but that's not the entirety of the burden of proof. There's also a burden on the defense. I mean, if you imagine a lawyer just sat there going, "You've not met your burden. No, not good enough. You've not met your burden. No, sorry, I'm just not convinced." Instead of actually carrying their share of the burden to defend the client and provide arguments at why we shouldn't trust the prosecution and provide alternative evidence about the actual location of their client and so on and so forth. It's a bit more like a game of tennis where you're hitting things back and forth rather than just being sat there going, "I don't feel you've met your burden." The null hypothesis and innocent until proven guilty are not the same thing, but okay, yeah, maybe there is an overlap. They are essentially controls put in place to help reduce bias from a particular institution.
So it's just about the test. It's just about it's essentially a control to make sure that the test isn't biased by the scientist. A bit like a double blind. A double blind test with a control is there to make sure that the scientist doesn't have insert their bias into the outcome. Same thing with null hypothesis testing. It gives us a standard to work against rather than us seeing a difference and claiming that difference is real. We allow statistics to make that claim.
The inability to do a statistical sample beyond one, it isn't even a problem if you can actually confirm the alternative hypothesis. There's no dead bodies in my trunk. Go out, open your trunk. You don't see anything. That means that it was a really bad null hypothesis because you seem to have confirmed it by looking. But you need more of a universal declaration, an absolute declaration for the null hypothesis, something that can't be tested. And so you could consider it, I find easiest, by looking at set theory, by imagining Venn diagrams with two circles that don't overlap. And so your null hypothesis could be that no human beings started the fire. There's a house on fire. My null hypothesis is that no human beings started the fire. And so what I'm saying essentially is that the set of all human beings does not overlap at all with the set of causes for this fire. If you're not careful about how you kind of word that default hypothesis, you could just say, the set of all humans doesn't include whoever started this fire. And you've already made a mistake there because whoever implies a whom.
I like the introduction of set theory. I think it can work well, especially when you're, describing concepts, theism, and then types of theism, gods that fit within those types of theism, and so on and so forth. But I don't think that Matt's actually really explaining himself well here. And every null that he's set up, he hasn't actually set up a valid hypothesis first. He's just saying these are the nulls.
So if you begin with this as a way to establish what your default position is, at no point are we saying we have confirmed the null hypothesis or that the null hypothesis is the correct answer. Okay, these methods don't make proclamations about truth. They are all trying to establish the reliability of a particular model. And so if you start with a null that is the set of all humans does not overlap with the set of causes for this fire, finding any human that actually did start the fire falsifies the null hypothesis and establishes the alternative hypothesis that this individual started the fire.
So again, he speaks about the default position as if it is the null hypothesis. What's a position? Right. A position is a stance on a topic, proposition, theory, or so on. So the null hypothesis cannot be a default position because a position is something someone actively takes. If he's saying that by default we should accept the null as our position, he's essentially saying that our default position should be to believe there is no significant difference between variables presented in a hypothesis. Okay, cool. In regards to gods, what hypothesis?
Theism is essentially
Exactly.
acceptance of the proposition some God exists. Atheism is the rejection of that position.
Okay, theism isn't an acceptance of a proposition. Isms are not people and they don't accept things. It's the ists that accept or follow an ism. Atheism, as you well know, is polysemous, but I'll come to that later.
It is essentially a null hypothesis that says there is no connection between the set of things that are real and the set of things that are gods.
I mean, this bit's just confusing. Theism doesn't qualify as a hypothesis, so it has no null, and the variables that you throw up here are just meh at best. You're trying to squeeze atheism into something sciencey. Why?
Null, there is no, is essentially there is no overlap between these two sets. That's all we're saying with null hypothesis. The area where those sets overlap is null, is empty. There are no things.
So, right here, are you really saying that atheism is something no one should ever actually accept? If atheism is the null hypothesis and the null hypothesis is never accepted, then that is the entailment of what you're saying.
There, you could do it for anything. You could say there's no connection between fish and reality. And of course, this null hypothesis is disproved by the presence of fish. You could say there's no connection between vaccines and autism. And you would disprove that by demonstrating a causal connection between vaccines and autism. You could say there's no causal connection between aspirin and headache. And you might have some problems in some of these where you're going to have to go with strong correlation, and correlation isn't causation, which is why I didn't put causation in the first example about vaccines and autism.
It's interesting how all of Matt's examples here have been scientific, and he's using scientific language, but he's then actually forgetting to apply it properly when he's discussing atheism and theism.
You could say there's no connection between standing around in the rain and getting wet. It doesn't matter what subject you're using.
It does matter, actually. There are certain qualities already discussed that are required for a hypothesis and the null.
If you were to put together a syllogism, what we're talking about here is what is the premise that we're trying to test in like a reductio ad absurdum. You're going to be reducing your null hypothesis to the absurd. You're going to be showing that it is essentially false. You don't have to have a robust trial of with statistical analysis in order to make use of the null hypothesis in this sense. In proper big studied statistical analyses, you're going to be a little more strict with your null hypothesis and your alternative hypotheses because there can be multiples. In the same way we say that there's no overlap between the set of people and causes of this fire, well, we could say there's no overlap between combustible chemicals and causes of this fire. You know, was it started by lightning? Was it started by a chemical spill? Was it started by a human being? Was it intentional? There's no overlap between an agent's intent to start a fire and the start of this fire. And you would show that, yes, somebody did intend to do it.
This bit just sort of seems to repeat himself over and over.
You can apply this principle of the null hypothesis as the starting point for virtually anything, as long as you're careful to make sure that what you're stating is something that can't be demonstrated, but can be falsified. And that doing so puts you in the position of, I'm going to tentatively accept the null hypothesis as my default starting place, that there is no connection between these two sets. And I will change my mind when that null hypothesis is falsified, when we have confirming evidence for the alternative hypothesis. Because the null hypothesis stands even without a statistical trial or data. It stands there forever until there's data that demonstrates it false. If you were, at one time science didn't understand a great many things, but the null hypothesis stated correctly for anything that we've, confirmed and discovered would still have been the same when there was no statistical data there to evaluate. You don't get to dismiss a null hypothesis merely because there isn't currently data to disprove it, or there may not even be a way to collect the data to disprove it at this point. That's the whole point of the principle of the null hypothesis, to establish a default position and point the arrow of the burden of proof towards an alternative hypothesis, because the null is never proved. It's fiat accepted as a baseline until someone finds a way to move the needle away from the baseline.
Okay, we're past the 10-minute mark here, and he finally mentions tentatively accepted. I mean, if we are charitable with this reading, then he means not yet rejected. The problem is, you don't actually go through life like this, waiting for things to be falsified. You wouldn't go to a bus stop and say, "Oh, has the 5A bus come yet, mate?" "Nah, I've been waiting for ages. Gonna get the 14 instead when it comes." Prove it! Not everything works that way or needs to work that way. And we don't need to be sat in a null state over every claim. The person's testimony should be enough to accept in that sort of situation. Sure, testimony isn't always worth accepting on its own. Testimony is definitely one of the weakest forms of evidence, especially when it's testimony about a memory. My God, I mean, our memories are flawed and we build pictures in our minds to fill in the gaps. And yeah, I agree. Testimony isn't necessarily the best form of evidence. In fact, it's, as I said, the weakest. But not everything fits in this paradigm of hypothesis and null hypothesis either. What's more, I mean, we have other priors which can inform our specific position. We might have enough knowledge to doubt the null, and therefore it's reasonable to not accept it tentatively or otherwise. And if you think about it, that's why we're actually looking for other answers. Like within science, they are investigating things because they think the null isn't true.
So for questions of does X exist, does a Chupacabra exist, the null hypothesis, which can't be confirmed, is that nothing exists until it is demonstrated to exist. And so you can have your set of, here's a set of things that exist, and here's every Chupacabra in a separate set. The whole purpose of having Chupacabra exists as an alternative hypothesis is that confirming it shows that there is in fact an overlap between Chupacabras and reality, which falsifies the null hypothesis that there's no overlap and no connection between those two.
Again, this is odd. This seems to be saying that things not proven to exist don't exist. So dark matter and gravity don't exist because there's evidence. There is evidence, but there's no real conclusive proof. For Chupacabra to exist to have a null, it has to have a valid hypothesis. Reality is also an incredibly vague variable, considering science has shown that humans do not perceive all of reality. At best, we've got a variety of measurements and descriptions of reality. Same with existence. I mean, existence and reality they're sort of entailed by each other's definition. One has to assume he means an objective existence rather than something simply imagined. But it's not clear in what he's saying. But if he is talking about this objective existence, he's talking about it being part of reality, because what is in reality is those things that exist, that are real. So there's even some problematic phrasing going on here.
Your null hypothesis can get very specific. You could say, there is no detectable God who lives in my sock drawer on Thursday evenings, which can't be shown to be true because we can't show that the fact that we didn't detect something is equivalent to that thing being undetectable. And so by making your null hypothesis say there's no detectable God is an assertion that can be falsified by showing that there is a detectable God. But you'd never be able to demonstrate that there's not a detectable God in there just because you don't know all the methods and ways to potentially detect something. As soon as you do detect it, though, that hypothesis is falsified. And that's what we're waiting on. In all the years of having debates and discussions with theists, they are walking in with their alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis essentially being that the set of things that are real does not include the set of things that are gods. And their job is to overcome this null hypothesis by demonstrating the evidence that shows there is an overlap between gods and reality. And that overlap, it would make theism the justifiable position. And until then, atheism in the default sense is the only position that's justified. It's the default, it's the null hypothesis. It is not in any way a claim that we have disproved gods. It's a recognition that most God propositions are unfalsifiable. And so it would be absurd for us to claim that we've falsified the unfalsifiable. Instead, you begin with this default position that there is no connection between the two, and it's up to them to demonstrate that there is. And while that doesn't match the literal definition of null hypothesis, for statistical analysis, it is absolutely, undeniably, he said, waiting for someone to deny it, that principle in action. And that's the key. When I say that atheism is the null hypothesis, I'm not saying in a statistical analysis of blah, 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 blah. And yet, we have a position where the statistical analysis, which may be a sample size of one universe and zero gods, continues to hold up until such time as they present the evidence that squashes atheism, the null hypothesis. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
I'm really glad that right at the end here, he's actually admitted that he's not using the null hypothesis in a standard scientific way. He spent this entire video giving scientific examples and using scientific language, but then goes at the end what is effectively, oh, by the way, I'm using my own version of the null, which is kind of, but not really the null, but so, yeah, you know? Well, great. So you're using the scientific language to what? Sound sciencey and give yourself some sort of authority? You bring up a number of concepts, and I'll leave the burden of proof now and just provide a link to some videos and articles, one that I've done, and actually considering the burden of proof and how it relates to discussions. You didn't really delve deeply there, and I don't feel like I need to either, because the main content is that null. But two concepts you did seem to delve into is that the null hypothesis and default position. And you reference them both in relation to atheism and theism. Atheism is polysemous, so I feel it's only fair to address all definitions. And we can see that, atheism works in relation to theism. So theism is the proposition or the propositional content of the belief that at least one God exists. Remember that ism is actually the concept itself. It's not something that is in the mind that is being accepted. It is something believed, and it is, say, the theist that believes that concept. Theism itself is not falsifiable. It hasn't been operationalized. It's literally just a proposition, and therefore it's not a valid hypothesis. And in fact, if you disagree with it being a proposition and you say, no, theism is a belief, well, a belief isn't a hypothesis. It's a mental state in the mind. So therefore, under either definition of theism, whether you see it as a belief or the propositional content of a belief, something believed, then it's not a hypothesis. And so if the null relates to at least H1, but in the paradigm of H1 to Hn, and there is not even an H1, there is no H0, as in there is no null. For fun, let's pretend for a moment that theism actually was a valid hypothesis, that God was absolutely clearly defined, that we had the ability to perceive all of reality, and we had a clear understanding of existence, and reality, God, and existence were all usable variables. And then because of this, we were able to operationalize tests for these variables. We would then have an opportunity for the null, right? It wouldn't quite be there's no difference between God and reality, as Matt states. It would be closer to there's no difference between God existing and God not existing. And therefore, the null would be that God does not exist. But just a reminder, theism isn't a valid hypothesis, so it has no null. We are just pretending for the sake of this discussion. So, okay, if the null is God or gods do not exist, then is atheism the null hypothesis? So let's look at a few definitions of atheism at least. Now, many claim atheism is just a lack of belief in gods. A lack of belief in gods is an absent psychological state. Psychological states, absent or not, are not hypotheses. An absent psychological state isn't necessarily a position either. A position is something actively held in regard to a topic. So you might lack belief because you've considered a proposition and you're unconvinced, or you believe it false, and that you might even have some other thoughts on it, which would still be active positions. Perhaps you find it meaningless to consider, for example. You might also lack belief because you're brain damaged, or you're in a coma, or you're a baby, you're an inanimate object. These are not positions. They are completely absent of position. If atheism equals non-theism, then it's essentially just a set of everything not contained within theism. It's much the same answer for lack of belief. It's not a hypothesis, it's not a position, default or otherwise. It's something that contains a bunch of positions and non-positions on the topic. If atheism is the negation of theism, it would be the proposition gods do not exist. So, if again we sort of be charitable and say, propositions themselves are qualified to be hypotheses without the additional requirements, then sure, right? This could be the null. So, if atheism equals the proposition gods do not exist, then theism is the proposition at least one god exists, and we pretend that they're valid hypotheses, then sure. Atheism in this paradigm could be considered the null hypothesis. But considering Matt is a big proponent of lack of belief atheism and will regard agnostics and ignostics and all sorts of types of non-theist as atheists, for atheism to be the null hypothesis, it would mean that lack of belief atheism is not atheism. So is atheism the null hypothesis, or is it a lack of belief in gods? Is it non-theism? We also have another problem here too. Propositions could be inverted, with the alternative proposition now being no gods exist, and the null being at least one god exists. This, again, is the problem with the propositions being generally unfalsifiable, and it's why they don't count as hypotheses. But yeah, sure, someone could say that gods don't exist is falsifiable by someone demonstrating a god exists, but that goes back to what's being said about falsification. Something could be falsifiable in theory, but it's not falsifiable right here, right now. I mean, Luke, do you have any final thoughts on this?
My final point, I guess, is just that I'm a bit shocked, not shocked, I'm a bit disappointed about how scientific terms are being misattributed in this way by the atheist community when we hold others to such a high standard of using scientific terms accurately. When we think about the words evolution and theory and all these words that get misused because of rhetoric, we have a really hard line on making sure people use those words accurately, and it's the same with null hypothesis. Null hypothesis doesn't exist really outside of a scientific framework, a statistical framework. You don't hear the average person talking about the null hypothesis, and because of that, it's been co-opted into this kind of like atheist rhetoric, and it is rhetoric, And I don't mind people using analogies. I just don't want those analogies to cause people to have worse science literacy, because that's what this does. Ultimately, it makes people think that the null hypothesis has to be a zero value, which it doesn't. A null hypothesis can compare two positive values or two negative values and see the difference between those values. It doesn't say that there are no effects. It says that the effects are different between the effects. um, it makes people think that scientists don't actively believe things before doing it, and makes it seem like the null hypothesis is the only way of doing any kind of scientific research, which isn't true. Um, and it puts a lot of, and it talks about the null hypothesis being linked to the burden of proof, which it isn't. It is just a paradigm in order to have good science results, unbiased science results. That's all it is. It's nothing to do with the burden of proof. There's no one who has the burden in that situation. It's a scientist having a paradigm to make sure that their bias isn't influencing the answer, and that's it. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I don't mind it being used as an analogy as long as it's communicated that it is an analogy, and I think that we ought to hold ourselves to the same standards that we hold other people to. Thanks, Joe. Bye.
Thanks, Luke. I really appreciate your insights, and I think I agree with you. We atheists want everyone to use scientific language accurately. I mean, consider how we demand that on creationists when they're using theory as just an idea or evolution as just a change in kind. Yet, when it comes to ourselves, We allow these colloquialisms of scientific and philosophical language to slip under the radar, and we don't address that with each other. And they then get used as if they are the actual concepts they're describing. And then we see folks demanding others learn about the null hypothesis and default position, as if that is how those terms are actually used in a scientific or philosophical context. Matt, considering the end of your video where you admit to not using the null hypothesis in a way that's like used in science and statistics, yet the only definitions and examples that you gave of the null were scientific, excluding the mess of the legal thing, please could you give a clear definition on how you use the null hypothesis and what you meant within the video? I'd also like to understand why you would want to use scientific terminology when you're using an alternate definition. What exactly is there to gain by using this terminology? Why do you want this terminology tied to atheism? Considering how I know you define atheism as an absent psychological state, and anything absent of that psychological state is some form of atheist, it does really make it unclear what you mean by atheism is the null hypothesis. So just to be clear, my final questions to you, Matt, are, considering you're not using the normative definition of null hypothesis, how are you defining null hypothesis? Why do you want to use a scientific term in a non-scientific way? What is your intent behind using scientific terminology in a colloquial manner? Why do you want this terminology tied to atheism? You define atheism as an absent psychological state. What do you mean by atheism is the null hypothesis? To everyone else, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this somewhat informative. It's been great getting back. I do apologize for the lack of live streams and videos at the moment. Life is hectic. Hopefully I will get back on it soon.